We are starting this morning in Jeremiah chapter 52. That's the last chapter of Jeremiah. We should be able to finish, even with our late start on class here. Try to wrap this one up today. So it's been, as I joked with the church this morning, it's been 70 weeks for us in the book of Jeremiah, and that's a very good Jeremiah number, the 70 years of exile. You have the Daniel prophecy about the 70 weeks, if you look at one of Daniel's visions from the Lord in the book of Daniel. So anyway, we are Jeremiah chapter 52, and by my notes, we're picking up at verse 10. So for context, we began to see the fall of Jerusalem at the start of the chapter. The king tried to sneak out the wall with his army, and they headed for Jericho. They headed towards the Jordan River. They didn't quite get there. Nebuchadnezzar's army, the Chaldeans, caught up to them and captured them, and now have brought them to Riblah, which is part of Syria to the north, where Nebuchadnezzar was making his headquarters during this siege. And that's where we pick up this morning. Any questions on where we are in the book of Jeremiah at this point? The king of Babylon slaughtered the sons of Zedekiah in regards to his eyes, and even all the chiefs of Judah he slaughtered in Riblah. The eyes of Zedekiah he made blind. He bound him in bronze, and the king of Babylon brought him toward Babylon, and he gave him into the house of visitation until the day of his death. So Nebuchadnezzar forces Zedekiah to watch the death of his sons and also his officials. We don't know the names of all of Zedekiah's sons. There was a chapter earlier in the book of Jeremiah, I forget exactly where, and I don't remember the name. It might be around Jeremiah 37, where there's a mention of a king's son that could be one of Zedekiah's, but it might be another from the royal line that was present at the time still. So we may not know any of Zedekiah's children's names, but Zedekiah is also not that old. He's in his 30s at this point. So these children, these sons, we're not talking about a 70-year-old king and these are 50-year-old sons, right? These are boys that Nebuchadnezzar is executing to attempt to end the royal line of Judah. And then that's part of the tragedy, right? The aim of Nebuchadnezzar is ending the house, ending the Davidic line. Ultimately, this is not the case, as we'll see at the end of the chapter, and it's why the chapter ends in a really weird way, at least contextually speaking, but we'll get to that at the end of this morning together. There's a promise that David's sons will reign, one of his descendants will reign on the throne of Jerusalem forever. It's a messianic prophecy we know is fulfilled in Jesus, born of the house of David in the city of Bethlehem, the city of David. So all that's still in play. Verse 11, Nebuchadnezzar adds wound to grief. As he gouges out the king's eyes, he renders him blind. Then he has him sent off to exile, where he's going to remain in prison for the rest of his days. ESV might have just used the word prison. I have house of visitation, because that's the Hebrew phrase. But it's not like, that makes it sound almost like one of our care centers, where you could just go in and visit the people anytime you want. No, it's a prison, right? It's the word visitation we've had throughout the book. God's visitation is judgment. When God visits sinners, he brings judgment. And so that's the picture here. But prison's probably the easiest word to use for that in English, just for clarity's sake. Questions on these two verses on what happened to Zedekiah? I don't think we have any insight into that. We just have that rest of his days or until the day of his death kind of a statement. So it could have been mere months, or it could have stretched out for years. We're going to find out about another king and how long he lives in prison there, but not on Zedekiah. In the 5th month, in the 10th belonging to the month, the year was the 19th year belonging to the king Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon. Nebuzaradan, the chief of the bodyguard, stood before the king of Babylon. He went in Jerusalem. He burned the house of Yahweh, and the house of the king, and all the houses of Jerusalem, and every great house he burned by means of fire. And all the walls of Jerusalem all around, all the army of the Chaldeans, who were with the chief of the bodyguard, pulled down. So we are a day and a month removed from when the wall of Jerusalem was breached. The 19th year of Nebuchadnezzar brings us again to 587. His reign began in 605. Nebuzaradan himself, the chief bodyguard, enters the city of Jerusalem. So up to this point, it had only been the army that had actually gone in. But Nebuzaradan, well, what do we know about him? His name appears 15 times in Scripture, all of them in relationship to the capture of Jerusalem. We get this text back in 2 Kings as well, so his name shows up there. We've had conversations around this in the earlier parts of the book of Jeremiah as well. So it's about the capture of Jerusalem and also about establishing Gedaliah to serve as its governor after that, which would bring us back to Jeremiah 40. Nebuchadnezzar put Gedaliah in charge, and then he got assassinated, as we looked at before. Verse 13, Nebuzaradan burns down Yahweh's temple. He burns down the king's palace, both of which you can read about the construction of them in 1 Kings 6, 7, and 8. Is where you'd find that from Solomon. And then he burns down the great houses. So verse 13 could imply to us that the unimportant homes, the little ones, got left behind, which would make some sense, as Nebuzaradan's actually going to leave some people behind, so that he would leave them a place to live, some shelter, as they're going to be there to care for the land and grow food that will get taxed and taken away to Babylon and all that stuff, right? The destruction of the king's palace is the symbol of the fall of a nation, certainly, and the end again of the line of kings. But it's really noteworthy that the destruction of the temple doesn't get more attention, right? Theological attention paid to the destruction of God's house, the place where he had promised that he would speak to his people, that they could bring him sacrifices for forgiveness, his holy dwelling place in their midst. They hadn't treated it that way, though. They had turned it into a pagan temple. They had offered up sacrifices and worship to all kinds of other gods in the temple while they'd abandoned worshiping Yahweh. 2 Kings 16 is a tremendous example of that, as the king at the time sees a fancy altar to a pagan god in another place, as he met with the Assyrian king and sends messages home to Uriah the priest and has him build one just like that. They shove Yahweh's temple off to the Yahweh's altar off to the side, and they build this new altar for this pagan god. And they put it right there in the center. So the people wanted nothing to do with the Lord, and he gave them over to their enemies. He no longer defended them. It's a lot of Romans 1. Romans 1 in the New Testament uses that language. Eventually the Lord gives sinners over to their wicked desires, right? He's patient, he calls to repent, but eventually he gives you what you want. So that's why the Psalms teach us that we should seek after the Lord with all of our heart, and then he would give us the desire of our heart, which would be him, right? He gives us himself. So the building of the temple of Yahweh sometimes gets called Solomon's temple in this time, so to contrast it with the temple that's built later, which then is often called Zerubbabel's temple. We don't meet Zerubbabel in the book, but we'll talk about him again later this morning still. So 1 Kings 6-9, good spot to go. Chapter 6 is the layout of the temple. Chapter 7 has an interlude as Solomon builds his own palace, but then gives us details about the furnishing of the temple. Chapter 8 brings us the dedication of the temple, as well as Solomon's actually really good prayer that King Solomon offers up. If you read 1 Kings chapter 8. So to give you a scope of the size of the temple, I'm going to read a portion of 1 Kings 6 for you. In the 480th year, after the people of Israel came out of the land of Egypt, so that would be 1446, so 680 after that would put us around 965, 964. The 4th year of Solomon's reign over Israel, which was 968, so 964 sounds pretty accurate here. In the month of Ziv, which is the 2nd month, he began to build the house of the Lord. The house that King Solomon built for the Lord was 60 cubits long, 20 cubits wide, and 30 cubits high. Anybody remember how big a cubit is? Yeah, 18 inches. I'm seeing several of you do the thing with the arm, right? How do you measure things before all the inventions of measurements that we have? Like, just have a string to measure something, and then, just hold it up to your arm and count out how many cubits it is that way, right? So 18 cubits, you can multiply these numbers by 1.5. So the temple is 90 feet long, it's 30 feet wide, and it stands 45 feet tall. That's taller than the gym that we're in right now. It's a bigger building than this in that sense. So continuing that text, the vestibule in front of the nave of the house was 20 cubits long, equal to the width of the house, and 10 cubits deep in front of the house. So the outer entry in, almost like a narthexy kind of area, described there. He made for the house windows with recessed frames. He also built a structure against the wall of the house, running around the walls of the house, both the nave and the inner sanctuary. He made side chambers all around. The lowest story was 5 cubits broad, the middle one was 6 cubits broad, the third was 7 cubits broad. For around the outside of the house he made offsets on the wall in order that the supporting beams should not be inserted into the walls of the house. So anyway, you can read more, but that's giving you scope and size, right? It's a bigger building than what we are in right now, and if you think of the construction of it and how much gold Solomon put into that room, right? Babylon tears it down. They destroy it. And then verse 14, just like we were talking about with the symbol of tearing down a king's palace, so with the city walls, right? City walls are a display of a city's strength, its defense, its pride. So as long as that wall stands, no one can harm us, kind of a picture. The walls of Jerusalem are destroyed. So the city is exposed to the outside. And that gets back to like the jackal and ostrich conversations that we've seen through the book as part of God's judgment. Babylon had no interest in letting this city stand and turning it into an outpost. They knew this city had to be destroyed. That doesn't change a century later. Persia's in charge, and all kinds of people in the region get upset when the Jews start to rebuild Jerusalem. So there's part of that still in play. They were even told that it was treason against the king of Persia by some of those people who were giving trouble to them. Questions on these? From the poor of the people, the remnant of the people, the ones who remained in the city, the ones who were falling, who fell to the king of Babylon, and the remnant of the artisans, Nebuzaradan, chief of the bodyguard, led into exile. From the poor of the land, Nebuzaradan, chief of the bodyguard, left for vine dressers and for farmers. So not everyone dies during the siege. Of the people who survived the siege, including the ones who fell to the king of Babylon, we might hear that phrase and think they died, but this is surrendered. Jeremiah gave them that instruction halfway through the book. Back in Jeremiah 21, verse 9, they were told, surrender to Babylon and you will live. Stay in the city and you'll die, but surrender and you'll live. But it's the Hebrew word fall, so that's why I used fall in the translation. So they fell to the king. They threw themselves before the king's feet, right? Have mercy on us, spare us. It's that picture. So Nebuzaradan's in charge of leading this crew into exile, marching them east. It's a long journey. It's about 500 miles to get to Babylon from there. Even at a pretty decent clip of 20 miles of walking a day. How many of you want to walk 20 miles tomorrow? No takers. All right. But at a decent clip of 20 miles a day, that would still take 25 days to walk from there to Babylon, right? This is not an easy trip for anyone at all. The artisans get mentioned. So the poor certainly mentioned. We've talked about the poor in earlier parts, that the idea that as Nebuchadnezzar gives them houses, he gives them land, he gives them responsibilities. These are all things they didn't have before, a way of building loyalty out of this little group of people who had nothing in the past, and now they have things. But the artisans, that's the first mention I think we've had of them in the book. These are those who, they can build stuff. They're the ones who make the tools. They're the ones who make the things that you use in everyday life. They're taken away. So you've got the death of the officials, so no one with quality leadership is left to lead the people in the promised land. Now you have all the basically tool makers taken away as well. It's going to make things difficult. It keeps the people low, humble in that sense. Again, chapter 39 to 43 covered a lot of this before. We saw the poor are left in the land. Nebuchadnezzar appoints Gedaliah to govern them, but one of them assassinates Gedaliah, and then the poor flee to Egypt because they feared that Nebuchadnezzar would come over and kill them all, but because he blamed them for the governor being killed, even though it was actually a plot of that Ammonite king Balus. And then verse 16, the land belongs to Babylon. At this point, it's part of their very vast empire. It would not serve them to leave that entire land empty and doing nothing when they could use it for farms, right? They can grow food there and use that to care for the rest of their kingdom. Questions on these two verses? The pillars of bronze, which belonged to the house of Yahweh, the bases and the sea of bronze, which was in the house of Yahweh, the Chaldeans shattered, and they carried all the bronze toward Babylon. The pots and the shovels and the snuffers and the basins and the pans and all the utensils of bronze, which they ministered by means of them, they took. And the goblets and the censers and the basins and the pots and the lampstands and the pans and the offering bowls, which were gold, and which were silver, the chief bodyguard took. So there was a prophecy about these things back in chapter 27, verse 19, about the pillars and the sea and the basins and all the vessels in the Lord's house, how the Lord was going to give them to Nebuchadnezzar. And so here we get to see that prophecy fulfilled. The description of all these things we just read about would be in 1 Kings 7. That's where you could find them. So you've got two pillars that are 18 cubits high. That's 27 feet. That might be about the height of the tallest spot in here. Anybody know? Anybody know the height of our gym? I'm just looking up and guesstimating. I had that question, by the way, in the Lord's Supper class. We do the end part in the church. We talk about the practices, the actual details of what do you do when you come to the rail and all that kind of stuff. And then they can ask questions about things. And one of them asked me how tall the church is at the highest point. And I have no idea. So if you know the answer to that question or to this one, I'd be curious to find out, because people do ask. And I have no idea. There's got to be a tool for that, right? We could do cubits. Stack people up. All right. So these are 27 feet tall. They are 18 feet in circumference. They are hollowed out, but they're built of bronze. In 1 Kings 7, they're even named. The names of the two pillars are Jachin and Boaz. Boaz would be a familiar name to you, the husband of Ruth, part of the line of Jesus. So they then have capitals on top of them that are another 7.5 feet tall. They're filled with lattice work and pomegranates, so decorations on them. Not the actual fruit pomegranate, but gold pomegranates you would not eat. There's the sea of cast metal. So in 1 Kings 7, you'd find that in verse 23. It was round. It was 10 cubits from brim to brim, so 15 feet in diameter across this bowl. It's a big bowl, right? It is 5 cubits high, so 7.5 feet tall, something like this maybe. And its circumference was 45 feet. And it had decorative gourds all around it. The sea was solid bronze, a handbreadth thick. So that giant bowl, that's a lot of bronze. It could hold, the Hebrew measurement was called a bath. It could hold 2,000 baths. A bath is about 6 gallons, so that's about 12,000 gallons of water that could be held in this bowl, which I looked it up. The standard American bathtub holds about 60 gallons of water, if that helps you make the comparison. This is a lot of bathtubs, right? This is a giant thing. It's called a sea for a reason. And then the sea stands upon 12 oxen. And the oxen, not real ox, right? Again, made of bronze. These oxen are in sets of 3 facing outward in each direction as they stand underneath this sea. And then we get detail about the construction starting in verse 27 of that chapter of 10 stands made of bronze that are going to be 4 cubits square. So they're 6 feet in both of the directions, and then they are 4.5 feet tall. And these 10 stands then have these basins, smaller but still big bowls, but those bowls then stand on top of these. The stands are highly decorated. Each of the bowls could hold 40 baths, which comes out to 240 gallons, or about 4 of your bathtubs at home, right? So this is a lot of bronze that we're talking about in this spot on the outside exterior of the house. But again, the outcome of that prophecy, Jeremiah 27, verses 19 to 22. Yeah. Nope. Some of the work was done before Solomon by David, his father. David does a lot of temple preparation, even though God said you can't build it. David still does a lot of the work and gathers a lot of the materials and leaves them behind for Solomon. They have master craftsmen available to them, and they use a lot of, actually, Tyre, Tyre, the city to the north. Hiram, king of Tyre, and his men do a whole lot of this work, which is intriguing that the building of the temple gets outsourced to pagans. Maybe not the best idea Solomon had, but anyway, so there's a lot of work put into that. But exactly how they did it, I don't know we can answer. Patty, what were the bowls for? The priests to do their various duties. So you've got them filled with water. They're going to use the water to wash. They're going to have to clean up the altar after they've sacrificed on it, all the blood, the basic washing of hands beforehand. So some of those things. The temple service never gets described to us as fully as the service of the tabernacle did. We know a lot more about the tabernacle actually in the Old Testament than we do of the temple. Because the tabernacle duties just assumedly get imported to the temple, but everything was bigger. So I don't know. Mm-hmm. Yeah, so there are great similarities between the tabernacle and the temple. So we'll credit Solomon for that one, even if he did use pagans to do it. But the tabernacle had the gold, silver, and bronze in play. And as a reminder, with God's throne being in the middle, the closer you were to the throne, the more stuff was made of gold. The further away, the less precious metals were used. So if you're outside of the tabernacle in its court, things are made of bronze. But you move in and everything's gold. So that's part of the picture. What happens to it? We don't fully know. So parts of it at different times, well, there's the time where the ark gets captured by the Philistines, but it gets sent back because God curses the Philistines for taking it. They take it down, they move it with them all those years. They establish it in a couple of different locations where it becomes the center of worship for generations. But then eventually with Solomon in 968, the temple is built. Assumedly, the tabernacle is stored temporarily. Well, not stored long term at that point. But the last that we hear of it in tradition of the church is from the Apocrypha, where the Lord tells Jeremiah to take the tabernacle furnishings that are left and he is to hide them somewhere. Much like God burying Moses at the end of the book of Deuteronomy, it says nobody knows where to this day. It kind of ends up being that way for the tabernacle as well. The parts seem to survive. The ark, it would be one of those examples of something that Jeremiah was told to hide in one of the apocryphal books. So if we take the Apocrypha at its word, that's what happened to them. Otherwise, maybe when the temple was destroyed, they were stored there and got melted down and added to the rest. All right, so verse 18, these utensils are mentioned in 1 Kings chapter 7, verse 40a, just the first half of the verse. These don't get a lot of mention in 1 Kings. But these are the various tools the priests would have used for the regular duties, so whatever they needed to carry the water, supplies for cleaning, shovels for working with wood and ash, the tongs for the altar, the snuffers for caring for the candles, all those kinds of tools you can think about. So our altar guild can imagine the things they use to care for the church down at the other end of the building here would be good examples. And then verse 19, English translations do various things with the doubling of those Hebrew words. So Hebrew just says gold, gold, and then it says silver, silver. So ESV, as they translate it, they went with as, so that was of gold. They took away as gold, and they do the same with the silver. NASB instead translates these as fine gold and fine silver. So basically the best of gold, the best of the silver, right? That's the picture NASB went with. So you can do with that what you'd like. The choicest gold, choicest silver, perhaps. The first object in verse 19, ESV and NASB both translated as a bowl or a basin. I went with goblet, as that's something the lexicon suggested as a possibility for the word, but to emphasize something that's to be drunk from. We'll see the word down in verse 24 again, but there it seems to refer to the entry of the temple, so the word has some flexibility perhaps. So Solomon carries the tabernacle pattern that we were talking about before. Inner furnishings are going to be made of pure gold, but we see bronze up until verse 19. Questions on these slides? Any other questions? Yes, there was a lot of booty. There's a lot of plunder that Babylon got here, without a doubt. Because remember, what are some of the things said about Solomon, right? During his reign, silver was like stone. It was so common in Jerusalem. And so God had blessed his people. He had prospered his people, and they turned it against him. Just like we see when they plunder Egypt, and God gives them all the gold from their Egyptian neighbors, and then what do they do with it? They melt it down and make a calf, and they worship the calf, right? Our sinful hearts. The two pillars, the 1C, the 12 bowls of bronze which were under the base, which King Solomon made for the house of Yahweh, there was not a weight for their bronze, all these articles. The pillars, 18 cubits, the height of one pillar, the thread surrounding, 12 cubits, and its thickness, 4 fingers, hollow. The capitals upon it of bronze, the height of the one capital was 5 cubits, the lattice work and pomegranates upon the capital all around, each of bronze, and as these belonging to the second pillar, and pomegranates. And there were 96 pomegranates toward the wind. All the pomegranates were 100 upon the lattice work all around. So 1 Kings 7:47 agrees the weight of the bronze was so much they didn't even bother to measure it all. It was just not counted. And that again goes back to Solomon's wealth. He could build something like this and not care, right? He had so much. But the other side of that too is they spared no expense as they constructed God's house. And that's something to give them credit for, right? A symbol of their strong faith, both of honoring God the Most High and also knowing that he would care for them, whatever they were giving up for this. So a set-apart building for God. In verse 21, we were going over these details from Kings already. We get the phrase, a thread around. ESV, I think, just went ahead and used the word circumference. But how would you measure a circumference? They took a string, they wrapped it around the thing, and then they took it off, and they did the cubit measurements, right? How many cubits is this? There were ancient cultures that were familiar with the idea of pi and the ability to calculate that, but it comes a lot more prominent in the time of the Greeks later on for that mathematical equation, which is what? The area of the circumference, the circumference of an object. How do you calculate it? 2 pi r. There we go. Somebody's on it this morning. So, verse 22, again, the capital is described in 1 Kings 7, verse 16. Verse 23, toward the wind, seems to reference facing outward. So these decorative pomegranates placed all around the capital so they can be seen, right? They're not filling the capital like candy in a box or something like that, but they're meant to be seen. 1 Kings 7 does say that each of the 2 pillars has 200 pomegranates. So a total of 400 pomegranates on these pillars. We don't have 400 here, right? We might have 196, maybe, in which case we're only missing 8, which isn't too bad after all those years, because this is a building that's 400 years old. And there are many eras where it didn't get cared for. So examples of that we see in the scriptures, 2 Kings chapter 12, Jehoiada the priest builds a temple treasury. So he builds a box where people can bring offerings, and when the box gets filled up, they would use the money in it to repair the temple. They didn't have a system like that before Jehoiada. They just were leaving the temple in disrepair, in bad condition. 2 Kings 22, that treasury is mentioned again, where the priest Hilkiah finds at the bottom of the treasury box the Bible, basically. He finds the books of Moses, the law. He brings them out. He brings them to the king. The king grieves greatly, saying, we're not doing any of this. No wonder God doesn't like us, basically, right? So they hadn't looked in the treasury in how long? They didn't even know God's word. They didn't have it. They had it. It was right there. They just didn't. It was like a book on your shelf in your basement that you never see anymore, right? That's all it was to them until it was found again. So, yeah, they're not always doing such a good job caring for the temple as they should have been. Questions on these? It's the first time Jeremiah's brought them up. He's talked about the destruction of the temple in previous texts in the book, but he left all this for now. The chief of the bodyguard took Seraiah the chief priest and Zephaniah the second priest and 3 guards of the threshold. And from the city he took 1 eunuch, who was the overseer upon the men of battle, and 7 men, ones seeing the face of the king, whom he found in the city, and the chief scribe of the army, the one who mustered the people of the land, and 60 men from the people of the land, who were being found in the midst of the city. And Nebuzaradan, chief of the bodyguard, took them and led them to the king of Babylon toward Riblah. And the king of Babylon smote them, and he killed them in Riblah in the land of Hamath. And Judah was led into exile from upon its own land. So I mentioned we would see that word from verse 19 again that was translated as goblet or bowl or basin. It's this threshold word. So these are 3 guards, and they could be guards of the goblet, which would be an interesting phrase. If there is something that is meant to be drunk by the priest, these guards care for that, make sure nobody else can come and take of it. There's certainly Old Testament connections to that, like King David eating the bread of the table of the presence, although it wasn't meant for him, at Nob, when the priest gave it to him. So are these men doorkeepers, or do they guard the holy vessels of God's house? Is an interesting conversation to think about. But we also had Seraiah last week. We met him in chapter 51, verse 59. A different Seraiah, we think it would appear. There could be as many as 4 different guys by this name in the book. None of the first 3 are mentioned with the title chief priest. And it would seem peculiar if they actually were the chief priest that Jeremiah would leave that detail out, especially when you look at all the times he says Nebuzaradan, and he's always sticking his title by Nebuzaradan's name, which gets a little redundant in English, but there he is, chief of the bodyguard, again and again, right? So chief priest is not given to the other Seraiahs, so we think this is a different Seraiah than we've had before. And then there's also the second priest as well, and then, again, some of the guys who serve in the temple. This would be like somebody storming the Vatican and capturing the Pope and one of his cardinals, and then some of the archbishops, right? That's kind of the picture here in terms of the hierarchy of the church at the time. Verse 25, so together with these 5 allegedly holy men, although how have they done at being holy men? Right? The temple would not be destroyed if they had actually been doing what they were supposed to do. So these 5 are not really holy. But then also along with them, Nebuzaradan's going to take a eunuch, the official that oversaw the entire army of the king of Jerusalem, and he also takes 7 others who saw the king's face. So king's officials, right? They were in his court. They would see him every day, or most days maybe. They also took the army's scribe or secretary, whose job it was to summon the army when it was time for battle, and then 60 others. So if you're counting, that's 74 guys Nebuzaradan rounds up and takes to Riblah to be killed by the king. These are both political, army, and spiritual leaders of the people of Judah. And Nebuchadnezzar puts all 74 of them to death. We remember this is divine judgment. They've rejected the Lord. They've offered sacrifices to false gods. They've not repented. They trust their idols. So, practically speaking, for Nebuchadnezzar, this could be an act of simply, again, oppressing Judah, wiping out Judah's leaders. Who's going to lead the people now, kind of a thing. But again, it could also be the idea of Nebuchadnezzar recognizing this as God's divine judgment. Nebuchadnezzar has a relationship with the Lord. You see that clearly in the book of Daniel. So how much does he know? It's a question I don't think we can answer. Anything on these? We don't know. The ark is never mentioned again after. Well, it's brought into the temple by King David brings it into Jerusalem, and then Solomon puts it in the temple, I think in 1 Kings 8. I don't know if it's mentioned again after that point. But again, as the question earlier, the book of Jeremiah in the Apocrypha is instructed by the Lord to take the ark and to hide it. So if we take that seriously, then that's what ends up happening. It disappears. Or if that Apocrypha text isn't faithful and good, then it may have been among the things that they captured, but they just took it as gold because they could care less about this being some other god's throne. Didn't matter to them in that way. This is the people whom Nebuchadnezzar led into exile. In the 7th year, 3,023 Judahites. In the 18th year, belonging to Nebuchadnezzar from Jerusalem, 832 souls. In the 23rd year, belonging to Nebuchadnezzar, Nebuzaradan, chief of the bodyguard, led into exile 745 Judahite souls, all the souls 4,600. So Nebuchadnezzar is going to take 4 waves of exiles. Nebuchadnezzar begins his reign in 605, and he takes some exiles then, including Daniel, Hananiah, Azariah, Mishael, the guys whose Babylonian names, Belteshazzar, Shadrach, Meshach, Abednego, along with some of the royal family, some of the nobility. So it was a clear cut across the top in 605 to take some of the potential future leaders and devastate the kingdom of Judah in that way by making it harder for them to think they had a future. So while Nebuchadnezzar's strategy has flaw to it, kidnapping children's not a good idea, right? We would reject that. At the same time, you can see his strategy as a king. He's got a vast empire filled with various people groups. He can't understand all their cultures. So he brings in kids from these other cultures. He raises them up in Babylon. He teaches them all things Babylonian. Culture, language, politics, history. They learn all those things. And so then as young men, they can come into the king's court. They can help him see the cultural differences. They can help him understand how to rule these other places of his kingdom. And for the most part, it actually seems like Nebuchadnezzar's rule over the people back in the Promised Land's not too bad. It's certainly not like it will be under the Greeks and the Romans in the future times. So 605 is the starting point. That one gets skipped. Jeremiah doesn't mention that exile here at all. He only has the 3. So the next one is the 7th year of Nebuchadnezzar, which would be 598. We would usually say 597. Those are close enough. At that time, King Jehoiakim is taken prisoner by Nebuchadnezzar. He's brought back into captivity in Babylon with all of his officials. And as 2 Kings 24 says, all the men of valor, 10,000 captives, his craftsmen and his smiths. That's a larger number than what Jeremiah says here, right? 10,000 is bigger than Jeremiah getting very specific with 3,023. Right? Jeremiah is not rounding numbers on us at this text. The best suggestion I could find is that the number of people specifically of the tribe of Judah was 3,023, while there was still remnants of a few of the other tribes that Nebuchadnezzar took at that time that would have added it up to 10,000. So I think that's probably a good faithful way to look at the text. Judahite, Judean, and Jew. They're all kind of synonyms. They're all similar words to each other, but they seem to have their time frame to them. The short-term Jew is the one that gets historically the most use, as we're familiar with that term today. A lot of people today, if you mentioned a Judahite or a Judean, wouldn't know what you're talking about, but if you said Jew, they would know, at least they would have an idea of what you were talking about. So a Judahite would be someone from the tribe of Judah. Judean would be somebody from the region of Judea. So after Nebuchadnezzar destroys all this, it becomes the province of Judea. So anybody from that area could be called a Judean. And then you can easily see how you get to Jew from either of those, right? Take Judahite, take Judean. The first sound out of your mouth in both of them is Jew. So it becomes maybe just a shorthand term. Certainly gets used by the Persians, Greeks, and Romans later on. But also a broader term, right? Not just somebody from the land, but also a connection to a religious group and belief and so forth. Verse 29, 18th year of Nebuchadnezzar's 587, so that's the destruction of Jerusalem that we've been focusing on in the chapter. And from that group that's left in Jerusalem, there's only 832 he takes captive. There aren't many people there. Think of how the mighty have fallen. Anybody remember the really big number of fighting men Israel had when they left Egypt? The 600s, right? 603,550. Right? That's what's specified for us by Moses. And that does not include the men that are under 20 years old, so any of the boys or young men. It doesn't include any female. So we can estimate safely a couple of million people coming out of the Exodus time in Egypt. And what's left when Nebuzaradan tears through the city walls of Jerusalem? Not even 1,000 guys to take captive for him there, right? That shows how far they had come in the wrong direction because of the rejection of the Lord over the years. And then we get the final wave, verse 30, in 582 BC. The fourth wave of exiles under Nebuchadnezzar is another 745. So this could connect maybe to what we had in Jeremiah 40, the assassination of the governor Gedaliah. Maybe Nebuchadnezzar really does get angry and he comes back and he takes a few more people into exile. There's no other biblical account that covers this fourth exile. We don't know anything more about it than this little bit that we're given in this kind of a context. But then you do the math, those three numbers, 4,600 people that the king has captured, exiled from amongst the Judahites specifically. And then we look at the next slide, unless there's questions on this one. This is it. This is the end of the book. We made it. This is our final slide. It came to pass in the 37th year, belonging to the exile of Jehoiakim, king of Judah, in the 12th month, and the 25th belonging to the month, evil Merodach, king of Babylon, in the first year of his reign, lifted Jehoiakim, king of Judah, brought him from the house of the prison. He spoke with him good, and he set his throne above in regards to the throne of the kings who were with him in Babylon. And he changed his garments of prison. He ate bread before him continually all the days of his life. and his allowance, a continual allowance, given to him from the king of Babylon, a thing a day, in his days up to the day of his death, all the days of his life. As I mentioned kind of last week, I hinted at the book of Jeremiah seems to have a strange end, right? What is this ending about? This is peculiar. So let's take a look together. Jehoiakim was king of Judah very briefly. He just had a few months to reign. He's the son of Jehoiakim and thus grandson of Josiah. So Zedekiah is Jehoiakim's uncle, just to rebuild the family tree for you, right? Of Josiah's sons, 3 of them take the throne, including Zedekiah as the last. But Jehoiakim had it for a few months, one of the grandkids. But he's taken captive in 597. So the 37th year of his exile puts us to 561. Jeremiah is probably dead at this point. So we had that conversation last week. We saw at the end of chapter 51 the words, thus far are the words of Jeremiah or something of that sort, right? Nebuchadnezzar's son is known to history as Amel-Marduk. He's mentioned here in the Hebrew scriptures as Evil Merodach. He reigns from 562 until 560. So not a long reign for the son of maybe Babylon's greatest king that they ever had. If you look at the consonants of Marduk and Merodach, it's the same 4 letters. So just different vowel pointings, different ways of speaking the same name in different languages. And that name is one of the Babylon's gods, right? Their chief god is Marduk or Baal. So you've got the god's name in the name. Amel, the Babylonian version of his name, means man. So he's a man of God, basically, is the name that his father gave him. Hebrew, the word evil is not our English word evil. The Hebrew word evil means fool. So you can imagine how maybe the Judahite people looked at this guy, right? They still leave Marduk in there, but they call him the fool of Marduk rather than calling him a man of Marduk. So it doesn't appear they thought too highly of Nebuchadnezzar's offspring, but that's all we get. So this is the 12th month and the 25th day. What happens on our 12th month, 25th day? Christmas. This is not that day. This is not the same time of year. Their calendar's different than ours. Their 12th month would be Adar, which is late February or early March. So this is right around that time. It's actually much closer to our celebration of Easter than it is our celebration of Christmas. So God actually prophesied in Jeremiah 22 verses 24 to 30 about Jehoiakim. He's also called by Jeremiah Coniah and Jeconiah. So he prophesied, he said, I will hurl you and the mother who bore you into another country where you were not born, and there you shall die. But to the land to which you will long to return, you shall not return. So God's punishment for this wicked king was that he would be exiled to Babylon. He would never see the promised land again. He would die in Babylon. So chapter 52 fulfills that prophecy, right? He does die in Babylon. He never gets to come home. The unanswered question of the text is, why does evil Merodach free him? And I don't have an answer. I have guesses, but I don't have an answer for that question, right? Maybe he thought a former king of this people could advise him. But if that's the thought, why not just use Daniel? Nebuchadnezzar loved Daniel. Why not use the guy your dad trusted? Maybe he hoped that Jehoiakim would still have favor with the people and give him influence. I just don't know. But anyway, that's what we see there. Verse 32, Babylon had a vast empire, lots of people groups. So you can imagine as the kings conquered various peoples, they might bring one of the leaders of those people and plop him down in the court, right? Amel-Marduk takes Jehoiakim and he puts him above all the other kings in his court. He makes him his second-hand guy, basically, which this should make a parallel for you. Does this story sound a little familiar to something else from the Old Testament? Who else was rotting away in prison, and then the king brought him out of prison and made him second in control of all of his kingdom? Joseph, right? It's an interesting parallel. So he speaks well with Jehoiakim. Verse 33, he replaces his prison garments that he's been wearing the last 37 years. He puts on probably a royal attire. dines in the king's presence the rest of his days. And then we get the verse 34, the word allowance. I think we think of the little money that you give to your children, but the picture here is of provisions. We might almost want to use the word ration, but ration has a negative connotation like scarcity, and this is not to be really a picture of scarcity for Jehoiakim. Right? These are his portion that the king is giving to him, a certain amount set aside to care for him the rest of his days. The study Bible, if you have one, the footnote on 2 Kings 25, verse 30, which is the parallel text, says, Babylon administrative records mention deliveries of oil for the sons of the king of Judah and rulers from other nations. So we have a historical record of Babylon that talks about giving things to the sons of Judah's king. So that's a curiosity. Similar question you asked about how long Zedekiah lived in prison. We don't get an answer for that here for Jehoiakim either, other than he's already been 37 years in prison in Babylon, but how much longer does he go? It's interesting because Amel-Marduk's reign doesn't last long. Amel-Marduk's on the throne for maybe another year after he does this at most, before his brother-in-law assassinates him. So his sister's husband, Nerigozar then takes the throne. So does Jehoiakim's life only last that long and he dies before Amel-Marduk is killed? Or does he outlive Amel-Marduk and the next king just assumes the officials in his brother-in-law's court after he killed him? Hard to say again, but those are some things that you can ponder. But why is this the ending of the book of Jeremiah? My best guess for you is that the purpose of this is to already give you a taste, to give you an introduction, to give you a hope in the promise that God's promise of a king over Judah is not snuffed out. Because Jehoiakim's family tree continues on. You know his grandson's name, we've already mentioned it, Zerubbabel. He's the one that will, in the return from exile, he'll rebuild the temple in 515. But if you'd miss it if you're not paying close attention. Again, Jehoiakim, Jeremiah calls him several names. He calls him Jehoiakim, he calls him Jeconiah, he calls him Coniah. That second one, Jeconiah, is in Matthew's list of the genealogy of Jesus. So this king is one of Jesus' ancestors. It makes it tricky because they add a letter to Jeconiah. It's J-E-C-H instead of just J-E-C as it is in the Old Testament. So I'm not sure why that happened in our English Bible. It's not helpful. It makes a word search not bring it up. But that is the picture that Matthew 1 verses 11 gives us. It says, Josiah, the father of Jeconiah and his brothers, at the time of deportation to Babylon, and after the deportation to Babylon, Jeconiah was the father of Shealtiel, Shealtiel the father of Zerubbabel, and then it just continues down the family tree, heading for Jesus. All right, so our study Bible, I'll let them end us here, the end notes on the book, both from Jeremiah and the parallel text of 2 Kings. Jeremiah concludes on a hopeful note. Despite Judah's rebellion, God never forgot his promise. Years later, God would send Jesus Christ as the atoning sacrifice for the world's sin. All of God's promises find their yes in Christ. Lead us by your Holy Spirit, Heavenly Father, that we may remain faithful to our eternal King, Jesus Christ. Amen. And then from 2 Kings, despite all that has happened, the Lord provides for the preservation of the house of David. For the next 50 years, the Judeans would anticipate the restoration of David's reign, which the Heavenly Father fulfilled in the coming of Jesus, a son of David. His kingdom, the church, shall never end. Rule over us, gracious Lord. Welcome and sustain us at your banquet table, which is a foretaste of the feast to come. Amen. And with that, we have concluded our study for the book of Jeremiah. Again, as a reminder, next week, we'll be here 1 week. I want to go down to the church for future weeks, but next week we'll be in the gym. We'll be beginning our study on why Lutherans worship the way we do.